And joining me today from Asan is Noor. Noor, how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing great. So what is your role over at Asan?
I am the Community Engagement Coordinator, which basically means that I do some public-facing communications and social media stuff, and I also do work to try and kind of build bridges and make inroads with communities that are traditionally underrepresented.
Awesome. And like most people at Asan, you're also on the spectrum too, correct?
Yes.
So can you tell me a little bit about the history of Asan as an organization?
Totally. So Asan came about pretty shortly after kind of the turning point for the Autistic Self Advocacy movement, which it really kind of started becoming more organized at an individual level around the 1990s as a part of the kind of broader disability rights movement. Asan was technically founded in 2006 as a direct response to basically the fact that there weren't really representative autistic voices anywhere. It was largely people around us rather than us ourselves. And when it came to the National Dialogue on Autism, we wanted to be able to represent and speak for ourselves. Asan became more widely known around December 2007 after a very successful letter writing campaign that ended up stopping the ransom notes campaign, which was this entire horrible affair. And Asan was one of the groups that pretty strongly advocated for that to stop and made a letter writing campaign saying, disability does not in fact make you not a human being. Asan really did start as kind of a grassroots thing. It was literally started by a couple of individual autistic people just on laptops all across the US. And it grew as an all-volunteer organization starting in 2006, and then into a chapter network. And then eventually it would continue to grow and get a national profile by continuing to kind of talk to people and about people who are speaking about us without us.
Can you tell me about how you got involved with Asan?
My story with coming into Asan is actually pretty funny because my whole story as an activist and kind of a community organizer is that I always joke that I've been an activist since I was I think 11 or 12, because my first leadership position was I think student council in middle school. And I remember that I very much had this tendency to kind of go there's things that need to be changed in order for people to do better. And when you're 12, obviously that's a smaller scale issue, right? It's just sometimes people feel sad and there's no one to help them not feel sad. We should do something about that. And then as you get older, you recognize the bigger systemic interlocking issues, what have you.
It starts from there should not be a 2-to-1 ratio of chocolate to strawberry milk in the cafeteria to, oh my God, human rights.
Yes. But yeah, so we start there. And then what I call my big swap here was when I entered college, because I got recruited as a freshman to do policy work and policy writing for a new LGBT plus advocacy group on campus. It was called Rainbow Guard. It no longer exists because we basically got everything we fought for, but
nice.
Yeah. We did our job well enough that we didn't need to exist anymore. It was great. When I went to college, I ended up writing about a 20-30 page proposal for an LGBT center on campus because we didn't really have many resources that were directly allocated for LGBT people, and we didn't have a proper set of policies in place in terms of anti-discrimination measures, which, given that I grew up in kind of suburban borderline rural North Texas, this was actually a big deal because we didn't necessarily have all of those protections otherwise. So I wrote this giant proposal. Well, it was the first time that I'd actually done something that big in its entirety on my own. We submitted it. It went through a whole bunch of red tape, and it got presented to the Student Finance Committee, and they basically went, so construction on this campus is built out for literally the next 10 years, but we'll give you literally all the things you asked for, just not the physical space. And we were like, okay, well, we'll take that, sure. And once we had that first win, we kept building off of it and progressively got more and more of the things that we wanted on campus, and it was really great. And the reason that I bring up this whole kind of journey is that that is pretty directly what led me into disability justice advocacy, because I got Like, I found out I was autistic around like my second or third year of college, because like most autistic people of color that get coded as female, we did not we did not have any access to testing from a fairly young age. It happened to be that towards like the end of college, one of my friends sent me the job posting that Asan had posted for the current position I have, which is community engagement coordinator. And the job listing was basically just exactly what I was doing, but at a much, much, much larger scale. And I was very transparent about that when I applied, and was just like, so I'm doing this thing, but I'm doing it at a college level because I'm 18 and I don't have access to a bigger audience, ... But I really do think that I could work with this, and it ended up working.
That's awesome. And how long have you been at Asan now?
3, almost 4 years. I think it'll be 4 in October.
So what kind of work and what kind of programs does Asan do typically?
That is a really good question. We are a policy-based org who happens to kind of be a jack of all trades. We do a lot of things. But like in terms of policy work, some of the issues that we focus on basically center around autistic people and disabled people more broadly being able to make our own choices without discrimination getting in the way. And that extends to things like home and community-based services, which is the fancy term for if you need help to do things like take your meds, get dressed, go places, having someone who can help you do that and have them be paid appropriately in your own home rather than an institutional setting. And we do a whole bunch of things from easy read toolkits all the way up to advocating for actual individual pieces of legislation. We do work around supported decision making, which basically is an alternative to guardianship, where if you need support making an individual choice, you're allowed to bring in someone who can give you more information or help walk you through steps, or basically take on the individual parts that you need, the additional help that you need, without making the decision for you. So the final call on, say, where you live, who you live with, what kind of food you want to eat is ultimately your call. You just also have the ability to legally bring in people who have additional information that you might not. We have like a laundry list of other issues. One of the big ones that we did for this year was fighting COVID-19 discrimination in medical settings, which is incredibly depressing. But the reality of the thing is that a whole lot of places had policies that basically equated to saying that if you were medically complicated or had disabilities that they thought made your life less worthy, that you were lower priority for access to things like ventilators or long-term COVID care. And we were one of, thankfully, a number of organizations that were just like, hey, consider, no, that's really bad and discriminatory and illegal. When we notice that there is a current event that our community might want to engage on, we do something called action alerts, which is basically an email and website post where we spell out in plain language, like, here's the bill or the issue that is currently happening and that has like a current action to take right now. If you want to call your elected officials, here is a sample script of what we think about the thing. And here is like more information basically about what the current issue is. And we kind of put that out to our email list and to our social media, so that way people have access to like the basic information of what's going on and info of like a sample of how they could talk about it. And part of that is a proxy calling system. It's a volunteer network basically, where if someone wants to make a call but for a disability related reason is unable to, whether that's just like phone anxiety, or if someone might be an AAC user but is concerned that they might get hung up on if they use their device on the phone because they'll assume it's a robocall. They basically submit a form for the current action alert with the name of the representative that they're trying to get in contact with, a script including any modifications, and information for them to follow up if they have questions for their representative to send back info to them, and a volunteer will then place that call for them. Yeah, so that's kind of a vague summary of the policy half. The other half is programs, which is a mixture of like leadership training and celebrating various autistic and broader celebrating and mourning various disability related holidays. In terms of programs, the one that I'm thinking of right now, because it's coming up very soon, terrifyingly, is ACI, which is our Autism Campus Inclusion Leadership Summit. And ACI is essentially a week-long leadership training camp for autistic college students who have at least 1 year left of school. And basically we teach them about disability history, self-advocacy. It's inadvertently also become a really great place for autistic campus leaders to kind of meet and network and interact with each other. And because it's been going on for quite a few years now, it also kind of connects them to this longer pattern of autistic leaders. So that's useful on a variety of kind of levels. Some other programs that we tackle include Autism Acceptance Month, which is coming up terrifyingly even sooner. It's in a couple of days. And Autism Acceptance Month centers, as we know, the voices of autistic people, and is basically aimed at kind of shifting the narrative around the way we talk about autistic people from just autism, it exists, to autistic people are people who have a brain that is beautiful and nuanced and complicated and are part of a person that'll have things they like and don't like about themselves just like anyone else. So during that time, we do everything from releasing toolkits that are aimed at autism acceptance, all the way up to boosting blog posts from autistic people. We do giveaways for STEM toys and for an AAC app. Our giveaway for this year is the app Speak for Yourself. And we also typically will have at least one panel or event. This year it is a screening of the film Loving Lampposts, which is about 10 years old at this point, and kind of is a documentary film that just kind of looks at what the neurodiversity movement was like about a decade ago. So it is going to be available for people to stream for about 2 weeks in April. And at the end of that 2 weeks on April 15th, we'll be doing kind of a looking back and looking forward panel where we have older autistic activists and younger autistic activists kind of coming together to be like, things were different 10 years ago. What's changed, and what kind of work do we still have to do as a movement? Another event that we do hold every year, March 1st, is Disability Day of Mourning, during which we hold a memorial for disabled people who have been lost to filicide, which is the act of being murdered by a caretaker, parent, or other family member. And with that, we hold a memorial virtually. When it is not COVID, we host one in DC, and various autistic people and neurodivergent people from all over the US also host either virtual or in-person vigils in their locations so that people can gather when there is not a pandemic in person and when there is a pandemic online. And we're hoping in the coming years that there'll be more hybrids where people can have the option of both. Oh, and one more thing that I'd like to highlight is that we do easy read toolkits, which are a format that basically is designed to be really simple to understand. It has kind of less jargon built in, and it's more spaced out, so it's more accessible to people with intellectual disabilities, people who have certain types of learning disabilities, and just in general, if someone has challenges kind of getting through like academic reading, it can be helpful. And those toolkits basically explain like kind of the nuts and bolts of a given issue, and then explains different ways to get access to resources related to it. So for example, if you were to look at our Easy Read Toolkit on the federal budget, we kind of break down, well, what is a budget? What's the federal budget? Why does it matter to disabled people? And if you have questions about it, or if you want to take action or advocacy about it, what are some places you can reach out to or steps you can take? And basically we just break all that down in really basic, simple language, so that way people who might not have a background in it can kind of get their teeth sunk into the issue and figure out how to work with it.
And now, does Asan do any sort of like public education in terms of autism?
Yes. So a couple of different ways we do this. So in terms of public education, we will sometimes do public press statements or comments to media about given current events or specific policy issues. So for example, there was something that came out recently that specifically deals with making home and community-based services a consistent required category of funding. And we were able to release a statement basically being like, yes, we like this idea. We should fund HCBS all the time, and here is why, and here is the history of why that is. Just kind of in plain language on our website, and people can be like, oh, okay, so here's why that actually matters to autistic people, and here's why autistic adults might talk about that. So that's one kind of level of it. The stuff that people might be more familiar with, though, just based on kind of the media landscape we're in, is that we do also consult on some types of media. So for example, one that we worked on is a short from Pixar called Loop, which follows a non-speaking autistic girl and camp member who are kind of going on an adventure and spending a day making the loop, so the travel around a pond in a kayak. And they're attempting to kind of navigate between Renee, who is a non-speaking autistic girl of color, and Marcus, who is a regularly speaking neurotypical young man of color. And they're trying to kind of navigate between the different ways that they communicate and better understanding each other. And we consulted on that film because Pixar reached out to us and was like, hey, so we've made it a point to try and reach out to like individual autistic people throughout this process, but we also want to get an idea of like mass media tropes and things that you might have a view on as someone who does a lot of broader work. It's something that I personally am really proud to have helped work on, because a lot of people who saw that film kind of for the first time were either seeing themselves, because speaking as someone who is a semi-speaking person of color, I don't see myself in media, and unfortunately a lot of other people also have that same trend. And in a lot of cases, like one of the first times that they'd seen someone just kind of treating non-speaking people as like a full nuanced human being. And Pixar had a lot of that down before they talked to us, obviously, but like that kind of work, like touching on media and working through it and trying to kind of flesh out avoiding tropes and avoiding subconscious messaging that we've all internalized to some extent as part of the media landscape, as that like can kind of dehumanize autistic people, that can make a big difference. Some other projects that we've worked on media-wise have also included responses to negative forms of media. The most recent instance of that is that we worked recently with Communication First and the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint on a short film called Listen, which was a response to the Saya film Music. And Music, without getting too far into it, is a portrayal of a non-speaking autistic person, and the entire film centers around guardianship and kind of, despite it supposedly being a film about the main character whose name is Music, kind of centers literally everyone else and treats her as a burden. In response to that film, which had kind of this really tropey, full-on resistance to both including non-speaking autistic people as either actors or any part of the film, but also the representation itself and the structure of the film and the way it treated us. We were fortunate enough to work with these two organizations to contact a whole bunch of non-speaking autistic people and be like, so if you could respond to this, if you could tell them something, what would you want them to know? And we made a short film based off of that to basically be like, consider non-speaking autistic people have thoughts and feelings. And those thoughts and feelings about how we are shown and represented and how the world treats us actually matter and should be included when you're taking on the responsibility of showing our community.
I think the media work is very important too. I know for me personally, one of the reasons I got into the field I'm in, aside from liking it, is that there's a very specific memory I have, which is I went to a Philadelphia Phillies game, my dad, back in Autism Awareness Month, when in middle school, probably like 7th grade, I think it was. And we're sitting there, it's between the innings. They got all the commercials running on the Jumbotron. And this ad comes on about, autism, how can you help, whatever. And the whole time it's on, I'm just like, this feels like an ASPCA commercial. Like, this feels like I'm like, should be pitied or I have cancer or something like that. It was like, it just gave me this awful feeling of just like, and I could tell like my dad's watching it and he's like, yeah, wow, that's my son. And I'm just like, what? This just makes me feel
just like uncomfortable. No.
Yeah.
We do not need to sing in the arms of the angels, actually.
Yeah, and I know for me personally, that's one reason I want to get in is be like, yeah, there needs to be a narrative shift. And it doesn't need to be me going out there and making stuff about autistic people all the time, but it does mean being in the rooms where other media is made to have that perspective. And I think that's definitely really important work that you guys are doing on that end. So how is donations to ASN typically used?
That is a good question. So we've got our annual report for 2020 right here. So we have about 56% as of 2020 coming in from grants and contributions, that kind of thing. And about 34% are donations, so from either individual people, work programs, that kind of thing. So in terms of where the money is actually going, 76% of our funding goes directly to advocacy. And what's listed under advocacy here is everything from our policy work. So that's things like joining in on coalition letters about specific pieces of legislation, that's action alerts about given issues, given legislation, etc. And also toolkits about given policies, resources, or general information that we think that people need to have. An example of that would be that for Autism Acceptance Month, we have a toolkit coming out specifically aimed at parents of recently diagnosed autistic people. And it's basically a toolkit to go, so your parents and your kid just got diagnosed, now what? So rather than people kind of immediately kind of latching onto the information that tends to be provided immediately by providers, society at large, speaks, what have you, which is essentially just like, yes, this horrible tragedy has befallen and stolen your child. Well, here are all the things you can do to make them a real person. The toolkit is meant as kind of the alternative voice to be like, hello, yes, autistic adults, we exist and are present. Here are a bunch of things that we wish our parents had known and that we wish that our parents would have done to listen to us and what our goals are and what our needs are as kids so that we can grow up into autistic and otherwise disabled adults and continue to live our lives on our own terms, essentially. Other places that donate that money is getting spent, 11% is admin, so that's stuff like keeping the lights on, making sure that taxes are in order. 7% goes to leadership programs, so that's things like ACI and the various things that kind of go along with that to support our alumni. 5% goes towards fundraising, so that is, again, kind of keeping the money coming in. And then 1% is miscellaneous. Miscellaneous is kind of just everything else. So if you're thinking stuff that doesn't fit into the other categories like office supplies, that's probably where that goes.
How do you feel ASAN's policy kind of stands and their philosophy when it comes to helping people on the spectrum as opposed to other organizations that exist?
One of the things that kind of drew me to ASAN as an individual, but also that just as an autistic person, I think is really valuable about our policy and about our philosophy in terms of how we work with autistic people, is that at a basic level, we center autistic people and we center multiply marginalized autistic voices. And we are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. We will always be learning and making mistakes and continuing to improve and bring more people in. But at a fundamental level, one of the questions that is always like at the forefront when we're talking about stuff and when we're talking about policy is how will this impact autistic people who are frequently left behind. So what I mean when I say that is, if we're looking at a given policy, how will it impact autistic people who have high support needs? How will it impact people who are otherwise disabled and also autistic? How will this impact non-speaking autistic people? How will this impact autistic people who might currently be under guardianship? How might this impact autistic people of color, LGBT autistic people? Like, it's not a perfect system by any means, but like by trying to kind of bring the margins in to the forefront of the conversation as we're talking, unfortunately, that's something that while all organizations struggle with, I feel that like there's an intentionalness about meaning it when we say that all means all, and that when we say all autistic people are impacted by policy and we need to think about all of us, we do in fact think about all of them. We might not always succeed. We always need to improve. We always need to do better, but we can't ever stop thinking about the people on the margins. And unfortunately, in general, just like the fact that we are an autistic-led organization working on behalf of autistic people and centering the voices of, in fact, autistic people at the forefront of policy is unfortunately quite rare as well. Asan has this fundamental desire to serve as like an institution of disability pride, in that we aren't aiming for a cure. We're not aiming for elimination of autistic people or making us less autistic. Basically, at a root level, Asan as an organization, just like by existing and also in terms of the work we do, is saying autistic people are here, we exist, we continue to exist, God willing, over a lifetime. And we should meet us where we are, and we should be advocating to make sure that our community has the resources we need to continue living life on our terms. And if other people kind of stand in the way of that, we need to work towards making a world where autistic people can have those choices without other people trying to or wanting to stand in the way of that.
So while a lot of organizations focus on, children on the spectrum, and that's obviously very important, I feel like Asan has a very specific focus as well, or at least a stronger one, on adults on the spectrum, or newly diagnosed people who are now in adulthood. So could you talk about kind of how Asan stands to help those people?
Absolutely. So one of the reasons why we tend to center autistic adults is that less than 1%, or depending on how you round up about it, 1% of all federal funding typically gets allocated towards autism over the lifespan. So basically that's 1% of all federal research funding is going towards autistic adults, and the vast majority of everything else is either cures, kids, genetic research, what have you. And that tends to mean that like organizations broadly that deal with autism are focusing on kids, maybe teenagers, but adults tend to get left out of the picture. So we very intentionally center a lot of our work on that. That's part of why, while we certainly aren't against kids, for example, using our easy read toolkits to reach out to their senators or elected officials more broadly, those are generated with the intention of kind of an adult who wants to start advocating for themselves or their community. It's kind of very intentionally designed for people who are newer to advocacy, and a lot of the time that is autistic adults, because we kind of have most of our lives spent kind of telling us to sit down, shut up, kind of be quiet, and not look or act autistic, essentially. When people are willing and able to start standing up for themselves, a lot more of the time that ends up being in adulthood. So that ends up kind of being who most of those toolkits are directed towards. Although obviously if there is like a college student or a young adult or a teenager or even a 10-year-old who's just like, I want to talk to my elected officials about HCBS because I think that my friends, my grandma, what have you, all deserve to live in the community with me, then yeah, go for it. Use the resource, figure it out. But that's a nice side effect rather than kind of who those are geared towards. And when we talk about, for example, supported decision making or competitive integrated employment, which is the $10 word for essentially pay disabled people at or above the minimum wage and not the sub-minimum wage, and don't put us in sheltered workshops. When we talk about those issues, we do very intentionally like center the voices of people who have been through those things and kind of put them at the forefront. We really strongly believe that a part of making sure that autistic adults feel like they're a part of the community and making sure that they have the resources necessary to advocate for themselves and other people within the community, you have to both bring in the voices of autistic adults who have either had to do the same things before, or bring in the voices of people who are impacted by the issues that we're advocating about, but also that you have to speak to them the way that you would any other adult, even when you are doing it in plain language. So don't write it like a children's book. Don't cut out the nuances. Don't try to condescend or talk down to someone. Just kind of go, so here's the issue. Here's what's going on. Here are a bunch of ways that you can approach this. If you have questions, here are the people who can answer them. And that is that's kind of what a lot of our public facing work boils down to, is giving people, especially autistic adults, like the ability to kind of look at a thing and go, okay, so in the past 5 minutes, I've learned what this is about and how I can approach this, and I have some tips going in. Okay, great. That information's in my head. I can use it, rather than kind of putting a lot of stuff into kind of everything around us rather than us directly. It's really important and really valuable that when you're doing policy work that's advocating on behalf of a community, you take the responsibility very seriously of listening to them, providing resources, and giving them channels to communicate that feedback back to you. And that whole end of things of like very intentionally soliciting feedback from the community and treating that feedback seriously and kind of having that back and forth it directly with autistic adults is something that is valuable, and unfortunately something that's missing from a lot of orgs that tend to focus their programming specifically at kids, not because kids don't have opinions, but because when you're working primarily with children, there tends to be the assumption that those kids might not have certain life experiences, or that they may not have a full grasp on kind of like what life is going to be like front bound. So outside of their current like time period of existence, they might not know what to expect when they're 30, 40, 50, 60, whereas an adult kind of is looking forward more so at that point in their lives. So yeah, in terms of basically what work we do to kind of focus on autistic adults and people who are diagnosed later in life, the basic thing is that we make resources aimed with them in mind, we communicate with them directly, and we very intentionally work to try and make sure that we are listening to them and that we're incorporating their feedback into what we do, because they are our community and they're a part that tends to get left behind an awful lot. For Autism Acceptance Month, just in general, one of the cool things that's happened this year is that there's been a lot more of like kind of multiply marginalized autistic communities talking about like putting on panels and holding conferences and stuff. And it's really exciting to see that. Obviously, that's not like a directly ASIN thing. Like, we are not, in fact, the arbiter of every single autistic conference that ever happens. But like, I really think that it's cool and important that like, kind of as part of this broader wave of like more and more autistic people kind of speaking out and speaking up for ourselves and what we believe in and what we think is important, that like there's progressively more attention being pulled towards like multiply marginalized autistics and people who are like kind of usually left on kind of the edges. So like that is a thing that appears to be changing slowly but surely, and I am excited that that is a thing.
So, where can people stay in touch with ASAN, follow you guys, or find your information online?
So the best place to reach ASAN would be at our website, which is autisticadvocacy.org. The big email that we have for people to contact us is info@autisticadvocacy.org. You can most frequently find us over on Twitter at Self Advocacy, or if you search our name, we'll also come up. And you can find us on Facebook at the Autistic Self Advocacy Network.